Good day, everyone, and welcome to Reliance Partners Trucking and Safety Matters webinar on ELP or English Language Proficiency as it applies to both CDL and non-CDL truck drivers. I'm your host, Thom Albrecht, the Chief Revenue Officer of Reliance, and I'm joined by two of Reliance Partners Safety Impact Team members, Daniel Vega and Mark Barlar. We also have another safety professional at Reliance, John Seidel, and while he's not a formal part of this webinar, he is an outstanding professional and he may in fact be in the audience today. Certainly want to acknowledge John as part of the safety team as well. Certainly John knows his stuff as well. Before we get started here, we are going to entertain audience Q&A later, and the best way to submit questions is through the chat icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So let's not use the Q&A one, even though we're going to have Q&A, we're going to use the chat function for that. And really, before we get started, I'd like Mark and Daniel each to tell you a little bit about themselves, what they were doing before Reliance and what they're currently doing here. Daniel, why don't you kick it off for us?
Hi, everybody. My name is Daniel Vega, Director of Safety for Reliance Partners. Before joining Reliance, I was a state trooper in Arizona for approximately 10 years. Did my inspections in the southwest part of Arizona, attended the Part A, Part B training, hazmat and motor coach. Moved over to the insurance side of the industry around 2022, where I worked for Nationwide Insurance, helping our carriers with their safety and compliance. And now I'm doing the same thing for Reliance. My areas, Arizona, California, and Texas. I work a lot with the B1 space in Laredo.
That's great. Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Barlar. I'm a former Wisconsin State Patrol Master Inspector. I did roadside inspections for over 22 years in the southeastern part of the state, in between Milwaukee and Chicago, an area that sees 20,000 trucks a day bypass my location. During that time, I've done over 10,000 roadside inspections. I was an instructor, certified instructor for FMCSA for the Part A program, which is your driver's hours of service, CDLs, medical qualifications, hazardous material inspection program, cargo tank inspection program. And since 2020, I've been working with Reliance and helping our clients with DOT safety.
No, that's great. And for our audience here, I'm getting ready to go through some slides here, so give me just a moment. I do want to make a little reference. When I was in high school and college, ELP stood for a great rock band back then called Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but alas, we are in a new century, so today it means English language or English, language proficiency. Guys, why don't you just give me a quick acknowledgement that you can see the screen?
I can see your screen. I see the slide deck, the entire slide deck.
Okay, all right. Bear with me just a second here. Yikes. We've already got, looks like 5 questions here. Still showing the entire slide deck?
Yes.
Let me stop share for just a moment. Let's try it again. Okay, what do you see now?
The entire slide deck.
Okay. I tell you what, you guys have access to that. Why don't I walk through the first slide or two, and can one of you on the side see if you can pull that up? All right. First thing I'm going to share while we try to get the slides correctly. What is today's agenda? So we're going to go over some key statistics. Mark's going to walk us through a history of how we got here on ELP. And let me just pause it just a moment. Someone raised their hand. Oh, okay. Looks like there's some questions. We will get to the questions a little bit later on. And as I said at the beginning, we welcome as many as possible. But we're going to go through some key statistics, the ELP history, how we got here. What does the actual regulation say? We're going to talk about enforcement, consequences, particularly on CSA scores. We're going to run through various scenarios, and then how you need to prepare as a motor carrier, both in the short term and in the longer term. And then we will open it up for audience Q&A. So,
Hey,
guys, any success? Do I need to stop sharing?
yeah, stop sharing and I'll share.
Okay. All right, I'm done.
I'll just try to go along and
There we go. Yeah.
change the slides as we go.
Okay. We will have Mark and Daniel's contact information again at the end. So if you'll go to the next slide, Mark. Okay. And we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so let's start with some key statistics. First of all, the new executive order that came out on April 28th, and then just 3 days later, CVSA determined that the executive order was worthy of an out of service violation. This affects both CDL and non-CDL holders operating vehicles with a gross vehicle weight restriction of 10,001 pounds to 26,000 pounds in interstate commerce. We are going to talk about intrastate later as well. As of a 2023 FMCSA presentation, there were approximately 3.6 million CDL holders today. About 565,000 of them were immigrants, or almost 16% of the driver population or the CDL population, and about 137 were designated as ELP drivers. That's about 4% of the CDL base. Let's go to the next slide.
So I'll take this one. We'll continue to discuss the stats regarding the CDL holders versus U.S. labor forces points. It paints a picture to what Thom was discussing. We have over 500,000 immigrants not born in the U.S. Of the 24% labor force that are immigrants not born in the U.S., 15.7% are CDL holders, and according to the study, 3.8% have limited English proficiency. Now, I'll pass it over to Mark to discuss some of the history to let us to where we're at right now.
Well, and before you do that, I want to highlight that category of limited English proficiency. A lot of this, whether it's full ELP or limited, there's a lot of subjectiveness, and we're going to get into that a little bit later on when we talk about different scenarios. Mark, take it away.
All right. So how do we get to this, to where we are today? It all started way back in 1964 when the Title VI Civil Rights of the 1964 prohibits discrimination on race, color, and national origin. And then in 1970, FMCSA published the regulation requiring English language proficiency, requiring drivers to be able to read, speak English well enough to respond to official inquiries. Well, then in 2000, President Clinton signed an executive order that correlated English language proficiency with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, prohibiting discrimination on national origin. So they said that English language proficiency is a part of that, and that no U.S. agency can use English language proficiency to deny benefits. And that's where that started to come from. In 2005, CVSA added ELP to the out of service criteria. I remember this because we started to enforce this heavily in 2005. 2007 and 2008, FMCSA issued guidance on how to determine if a violation for ELP existed. And this was due to the fact that there was non-uniform enforcement across the United States regarding this. In 2015, CVSA removes the ELP violation from the out of service criteria. 2016, FMCSA cancels the 2007-2008 guidance and issues the current guidance, which is still in effect, And we're going to talk about that a little bit. The current guidance was limited the enforcement and allowed interpreters and assistants from third parties during inspections. And then this year, President Trump was elected. He signed an executive order on 3/1/25 that removed President Clinton's executive order from 2000. This didn't have an immediate effect on ELP until President Trump then signed a subsequent order uh, that directed FMCSA to rescind the 2016 memorandum. And then on 5/1/25, CVSA added the ELP violation back into the out of service criteria. And that begins on June 25th, 2025. So mid-year, this is very unusual for CVSA to add this back into the out of service criteria, because normally it happens on April 1st of every year. But since this executive order came out, they felt it was necessary to add it back in.
Yeah,
And
that's an
how we
amazing
got here.
timeline. Yeah. So
So,
tell us what the regulation actually says.
so the regulation specifically says, except as provided in subpart G, a person is qualified to drive a motor vehicle if he or she can read and speak the English language sufficiently to converse with the general public, to understand highway traffic signs and signals in the English language, to respond to official inquiries, and to make entries on reports and records. That's the entire regulation when it comes to the ELP, right? And now, what the out of service criteria goes on to state that a driver who cannot read and speak the English language sufficiently to communicate with a safety official to respond to official inquiries and directions in accordance with FMCSA enforcement guidance. And it says declare the driver out of service. This is pretty much what the out of service criteria had stated back in 2005. I was working with the Wisconsin State Patrol when this first came out. It's almost the exact same wording from what I remember.
Daniel, why don't you take the next two slides?
Okay, we're going to discuss that English language proficiency enforcement. So ELP enforcement has begun in several states. So this is nothing new. The regulation has been here for many years, but some enforcement people haven't enforced it due to that 2016 memo Mark was discussing. But we're starting to see the enforcement in several states more strictly. We have yet to see any out of service. I mean, as we know, it's not June 25th. So once June 25th gets here, I think we're going to see that number increase by a lot. Next point, some states waiting for the new ELP guidance before changing their enforcement activities. Me and Mark, former law enforcement, we've reached out to different states, people we know, and some aren't changing anything. It's business as usual until that guidance comes out.
So when you say guidance as usual, Daniel, you mean that if a driver requests some English assistance, they're certainly going to cooperate with that. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so it's business as usual. Like they're waiting for that memo so they could have guidance. Right now, they only have that 2016 memo. So
Okay.
they had 60 days from the executive order that President Trump signed. So, but we are seeing some states enforce it more. Some states are waiting as well.
And we'll get into some example states a little bit later on.
So until the new guidance from FMCSA is published, expect drivers to be sporadically be cited for ELP but not placed out of service. As we know, there's some states that enforce this already more strictly than others, and we'll discuss those states in a few minutes. Starting June 25th, drivers will be placed out of service for the ELP violation. I don't see that date changing unless something happens from here to June, but we're expecting June 25th to be that date. And then inspecting officers will have a wide discretion range across the US. I think this is a big point because officers will have the discretion. Some officers will continue to operate the way they do, maybe not write the violation as much. And then some officers are going to enforce this to the letter of the law, and they're going to be placing everybody out of service.
Okay, let's go to the next slide.
So the consequences for receiving one of these violations, 391.11, if you're cited for that violation for not being able to speak, read, or write English, it's a 5-point violation, goes under driver fitness. The only difference that's going to change is the 2 points for that service violation that you're going to get on top of that starting June 25th. So if a company does get several of these violations, you could see your driver fitness score increase pretty quickly. So a big concern is point number 3, the driver out of service, and definitely until ELP is complied with. So just like an example I'm going to give, if a driver doesn't have a valid license, he's out of service until he has a valid license. So with the English language, he's going to be put out of service until he could speak, read, and communicate in English, whether that's 1 week, 1 month, 2 months. But for carriers out there that have drivers who don't speak English well, I would recommend providing some training before you send them out on the road, because inspectors have the ability to check that last inspection that he received through the system they use. So it's just going to be that driver could receive more citations, fines could be more. Point number 4, vehicle may be towed if motor carrier cannot provide another driver. Most agencies aren't going to take the liability. Say, for example, if he has a hazmat load or something that's at the scale, they're not going to leave it there. If the company's from California and you're in New York, they're not going to leave it there until you could get a driver out there. It might take days. So just take that into consideration as well.
Well, and Daniel, just thinking of a question, and it may not be clear yet, but the same officer that may put a driver out of service due to ELP deficiencies, is it going to be the same driver that would approve him as finally knowing enough English, or do we even know that?
No, usually, I mean, the same inspector is not going to inspect you twice, at least. I mean, if you're long haul.
Right.
When I was working, I don't think that ever happened. But they have a system where they could actually see the inspection, and that violation is going to be documented. So he's going to know if you've already been cited for it, and then he's going to make the determination based on what he thinks if you're able to communicate and read traffic signs.
Okay, great. Let's go to the next slide. I think, Mark, you've got the next slide.
So our recommendations for what companies, motor carriers can do to help them out for any of their ELP drivers. Don't use drivers with that you think do not know the English language well enough to respond to official inquiries. This will save you from a lot of headaches. It'll save you from violations that will affect your driver fitness score. And it doesn't take a lot of violations to put you into the out of service alert, or I'm sorry, into the driver fitness alert for these types of violations. Record roadside inspections with audio. So if you're going to once a driver, if they are fearful if that they may receive a violation if they don't speak English well enough, or if they have a pretty heavy accent, I recommend recording the entire encounter with a minimum of audio. If you do it with video as well, perfect. That way, if we think as a motor carrier that the officer did something wrong, then we have something to go off of. Versus, we have a recording versus what the officer is stating. So they can use that in a possible data queue to possibly have this removed. And if there's a citation issue for this, which very well could be, we take it to court. We have the adjudication process with the data queue system. If we get a violation changed to a different violation, then the point value will go to 1. If we can get a dismissal with without court costs or a not guilty, then the violation gets removed from the inspection report. So that has a pretty good effect, and it changes the it'll show on the not only on the motor carrier CSA profile, but it'll show on the driver's PSP, the pre-employment screening profile as well.
Okay, so let's go to what I think everyone is eager to talk about. I'm looking at all these questions coming into the chat, and we will get to those. But we are also going to go through a few scenarios that probably are covered by some of the questions that are in the chat icon as well. We're going to draw in one of our top insurance experts, Jackson Alexander, to address the first two situations. So, Jackson, welcome. So let's take the first situation. Let's say it's a roadside inspection. The driver is declared out of service. In insurance, where towing is often a part of the physical damage coverage, is that gonna is the towing going to be covered with this driver having just been placed out of service?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. The short answer is no, unfortunately, because on almost all physical damage policies, there must be a covered accident from a covered cause of loss for the towing coverage to then be initiated. And a driver being put out of service is not a covered cause of loss on pretty much all policies. So, as Daniel mentioned, the driver not being able to drive, and then if we send another driver, if we can't send another driver and the vehicle has to be towed, we can't file a claim on our PD insurance and try to get reimbursed. That's not going to be covered.
Any chance that down the road insurance companies are going to allow a rider to be written that would allow for this?
I'm sure they could, and we could talk to some of our underwriters, maybe manuscript endorsement, but it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out over the coming months.
All right, let's go to the second scenario. Same thing, roadside inspection, the driver's declared out of service. Will cargo insurance cover perishables? Because again, to Mark and Daniel's previous points, it may be a while before you can get an alternative driver in there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, again, the short answer is no. Again, every cargo policy is slightly different. However, if the cargo goes bad because the driver's put out of service and we can't fly another driver there to get it or bring another truck and hook the trailer up and the cargo goes bad, that's not going to be covered because, again, that's not a covered cause of loss that causes the cargo damage. Um, Similarly, if we do send another truck over there, hook the trailer up, will cargo reimburse the transloading expenses? No, because it has to be a covered accident that causes the initial cargo damage.
You know, one of the questions that I got from probably 6 or 8 of our producers or agents in Chattanooga is that third bullet. And I think we know the answer to that, but we have a lot of producers that have focused on a lot of the different ethnic groups of trucking. On a go forward basis, Jackson or Mark or Daniel, do you think English certificates are going to be a part of the future? Or is it
Yeah,
too early to tell?
who knows? At this point, they're not requiring it. The markets are not, the underwriters are not. Once this goes into effect and really starts getting enforced nationwide, the insurance industry as a whole is going to have to react to it, and it could be something they require, but right now they're not.
Yeah. You know, and Daniel, you alluded to this on that next scenario, hazmat loads. So let's say it's not quite as extreme as the load started in California and the drivers pulled over in New York or New Jersey. But let's say, the nearest driver's Ohio, but he's out of service or out of his hours of service, whatever the circumstances. What's going to happen then to that hazmat load? The driver's just been declared out of service. Where's that load going to be taken?
Well,
All right.
there, Mark, you were going to say something?
Oh, sorry.
Go for
I
it.
was going to answer.
Go for it,
I'm
Mark.
sorry. So what the officer can do for hazmat loads, because they don't like leaving hazmat loads on the side of the road or at safety and weight facilities, they don't. Some agencies have policies that says they will not be left there, and if a motor carrier cannot get a driver out there to drive it away, or the officer will not escort them to a different location, then they can have the vehicle towed by a tow company. The tow company will then take it normally to their yard, and then they're going to start charging storage fees along with the tow fee on top of that.
Well, and as Jackson shared a moment ago, towing is almost assuredly not going to be covered as part of your physical damage as it relates to a driver that just got put out of service. So, okay, so the next point here, what about enforcement of non-CDL loads, that kind of medium duty part of the trucking market?
I
Mark or
don't
Daniel?
I don't think the type of load or weight of the load would necessarily matter in the case for enforcement versus the English language violation. I think the violation will be enforced across the board, whether it's 10,001 pounds or over 26,001 pounds.
Okay. And I think this next question is at the essence of some of the questions in the chat icon. How long is a driver going to be out of service? What's the path back? Um, and of course, right now it's very open-ended. But Mark, why don't you address that a little bit? Because I think if I asked you your wish list, if the FMCSA called you up, this has got to be on there. Help define this a little bit. But what do you know about this last bullet right now?
So how long would the driver be placed out of service? It'll be listed on the inspection report. They're required to list this thing. It's gonna say on there until the driver can speak English language well enough to respond to official inquiries. So it is indefinite that driver will be placed out of service. Now, what does the driver have to do to get placed back into service? They're on their own personal recognizance at that point. It's kind of the same as when you put a vehicle out of service for having a flat tire and then the officer goes home for the night. Now, did that company replace the flat tire? Or did they just drive off to another location to get that tire replaced? Or did they do something else? Nobody knows. But if they get stopped down the road and the same violation exists, then that driver is still ordered out of service and they can get hit with another violation for operating a commercial motor vehicle while ordered out of service. And in a lot of states, that is a disqualifying offense for their CDL if they're operating under a CDL.
Okay. Frustrating that it's so open-ended. Mark, let's go to the next page. And again, I assure everyone we're going to get to all these great questions. This is kind of at the heart of it. I think there's a concern, what types of questions and topics might law enforcement ask a driver to determine if his or her English is proficient? So, Daniel, you think they're going to ask about the Dodgers ball game, the Lakers
No,
score, their five favorite Italian restaurants? What do you
I
think they're going to be asked here?
I hope not. So what's going to be asked is basically your general, what I think is going to be asked. I'm not for sure, but the general questions that get past the inspection. So where are you coming from? Where are you going? Where did you pick up your load? Where's the destination of the load? When was your last sleeper berth? Can you transfer ELD? Can I get your license, insurance, registration? Those questions I think you have to answer. If you can't answer those questions, then I think it's going to be pretty difficult to not be placed out of service.
How about
Those
a
are
level one inspection? Would
yeah.
that be simple enough as well?
Well, yeah, because I mean, most officers would prefer to do a level one inspection. You have to know what step on the brake is.
Right.
You have to understand all the instructions for the level one. I know some officers, when even if they don't do a level one, they're gonna be like, can you transfer can you transfer your log to E-rods? If you don't understand that, then that's gonna be a problem as well.
So
So
you're saying in essence, they're going to ask questions related to
the
operating
inspection.
that vehicle, delivering the load, things that would be asked under a normal inspection, but now for the first time in a long, long time, if they can't answer them, then they could be placed out of service. They're not going to be able to rely from June 25th onward for some sort of interpreter.
And I think if I had to guess, it's going to be that memo is going to be a combination of that 2007, 2008, where it had certain questions and certain traffic signs. I think that's what it's going to go to. I mean, we'll wait and see, but if I had to guess, it's going to be something like that.
And Mark, I know you could add to that, but in the interest of time, let's go to the next bullet. What oversight and enforcement of state-issued non-domiciled CDLs will the FMCSA have? In other words, this covers, excuse me, a lot of the drivers related to USMCA enforcement, the B1 drivers and that. What do you expect here, Mark? The oversight enforcement CDLs, of course, issued by the state, but they've already kind of weighed in a little bit on this particular topic of non-domiciled CDLs.
All right, I just want to start with saying this is all an opinion. We have no idea what FMCSA is going to do. This is just my opinion. My opinion is on this is it's going to vary state by state. We see what's going on with the political climate today, with some states, pushing back on certain things, and other states just, saying, okay, let's run with this. FMCSA has their own CDL guidelines. They require the states to adopt all of their guidelines, right? But they usually require them to adopt them within a certain time frame, such as when the tank endorsement was changed from cargo tanks to other bulk containers that weren't cargo tanks that we when the aggregate amount gets above 1,000, then you got to have a tank endorsement. Well, they allowed the states several years to enact those regulations. It's the states that issue the CDLs. The federal government does not. The federal government guides the states on there. So will they have a say on how they issue out their CDLs? Absolutely. Otherwise, they'll lose funding from the government, from the U.S. government. So what do I see happening? I see that they may require states that they have issues with, where they saw a lot of non-domiciled CDL holders obtain CDLs, to review the people that were issued those CDLs and maybe bring them back in for testing. That's
Yeah.
definitely something that they could require, and it's going to be, but this is all, you know, my opinion on what I think is going to happen. But we don't know until actually FMCSA publishes their new guidance.
Yeah, some of the comments I saw indicate that the FMCSA wants to better understand what the rationale is for issuing so many of these non-domiciled CDLs. And it's not just about language, it's are they running safely? Are they complying with all trucking regulations? I think this is a bigger shot at some of the cabotage issues. It's not just an ELP issue. In the interest of time, we're going to kind of keep moving along. States most and least likely to enforce. Well, Daniel, let me just kind of throw one at you. For example, California, Arizona, Texas are your three states where you spend the vast majority of your time. What's the difference between maybe Southern California and Northern California? Can you walk us through? It's these kind of subtleties we want the audience to be thinking about.
Yeah. The big difference is I used to work in Southern Arizona, but let's talk about California, like Southern California, San Diego. You're going to have more bilingual inspectors that might not enforce this violation as strict as somebody like in Sacramento that doesn't speak a second language. Or you're not going to compare San Diego to like the Midwest or eastern part of the US. Like, I think that's the big difference here on how people will enforce it. At the end of the day, it's always been there. The added service was there years ago. Now they're going to add it, and it's going to be officer discretion at the end of the day. Do I want to place them out of service? Or I was able to complete the inspection and he understood some signs, he could go on. So it's all officer discretion at the end of the day, but I think locations of port of entries and stuff like that might play a role.
Mark, anything different to add to that, or do we want to move on?
Just real quick, I think the officer, absolutely, if they're bilingual or whatnot, depending on the area that they work in. I worked in Wisconsin. I know how the officers here work, deal with people, right? There's a large Eastern European segment in Chicago area. Just being foreign born and having an accent is going to have a little bit of effect of an officer being able to understand the driver when they're talking to them, and for the driver um, to understand what the officer is saying as well. So officers should, and it's going to be up to their discretion. They should take their time with the driver, try to get them to understand as best they can to see if they comply with the ELP requirements or not. Um, but yeah, I think it's going to be all over the board, and it'll be up to the individual officer to make determinations on this.
How about interstate versus intrastate? FMCSA is tasked with overseeing interstate, but one of the calls that we did ahead of today suggested intrastate is going to be looked at very closely. Can one of you guys weigh in on that real quickly?
I'll weigh in on that. So interstate, absolutely covered by FMCSA. Intrastate, FMCSA has hazardous materials operations. They have a say on CDLs, right? They're usually the same. But when it gets to that 10,001 to 26,000 pound non-CDL driver, FMCSA doesn't have a whole lot of say in that area when it comes to the states, because it's FMCSA can only deal with interstate commerce, and they can deal with hazardous material loads, right? So what the states are going to be up to their individual state on whether or not they want to go all the way down to that 10,001 to 26,000. FMCSA, they put out regulations that say, you know what, you're going to have to comply with this all the way down to 10,001. Otherwise, you're going to lose funding. The US government pays the states a lot of money to enforce their laws. They pay a lot of money for the highways, and if they don't do what they ask them to do, then they can start withholding those fundages, right? So I think it's going to be a little state by state basis when it comes to intrastate operations. And when I'm talking about intrastate, that doesn't mean the driver's just operating within that state. It's the load. So it's like every UPS driver out there on the road driving those small brown trucks, they're all interstate loads, right? Because there's something on that vehicle that came from out of state. That's a guarantee. But if you're a local landscaper, right, and you don't have any hazmat on board, are you going to be subject to this when you're hauling your trailer with your pickup?
Right.
You're going from Milwaukee over to Waukesha or to Madison, Wisconsin.
So I think what I heard is the load itself is going to matter.
Yes.
Probably no big deal, at least until June 25th. And if there's one area where maybe it develops a little bit more slowly, it might be the non-CDL intrastate. But again, we're all going to have to pay attention to additional guidance that the FMCSA will be issuing. We'll get back to fines in a moment. Let's go to our last page so we can share a couple of closing thoughts and then and begin to dig into the questions here. So let's go back to point number one in a moment here. Daniel, why don't you talk about look, kind of combine one and two here. What you heard, you were in Laredo all last week when all of this was breaking. It probably wore your ears out on all the things you were hearing. But give us some examples of what you were hearing, including point number two.
Yeah, a lot of the companies down there, as we know, they're B1 drivers. Many don't speak fluent English. They're a bit concerned. We spoke to a lot of carriers. Some said that they were losing some drivers because they were scared of this new regulation that was going to take effect. But some of them were already taking steps to correct this issue within their company. Some were handing out packets with traffic signs, the common questions for a level 1 inspection. Others were thinking about hiring an ESL teacher to come in. And I know the association down there in Laredo is already putting on English classes. They hired some ESL teachers, and I think their first class is this week.
You also, I think, ran into one fleet where they lost almost 20 drivers who just quit out of frustration. Is that correct?
Yeah, someone mentioned they lost about 20 drivers because of this.
Yeah, and again, I think there's a lot at work there. I think besides your own company, thinking about hiring either an English teacher or an English as a second language teacher, you may push your state associations to get involved and help bring about some educational programs as well. Mark, what do you think about just longer term, though, the impetus to look at your hiring and training?
So I would do everything in English.
Yep.
Provide everything when talking to the driver and dealing with them, do it all in English. For our current drivers that we suspect may have an issue out on the road, I would have a person do mock inspections on their vehicles with that driver in the controls, behind the controls, and do it all in English. It would take only a few minutes to realize whether or not the driver is going to be able to respond to a mock inspection on how well they will do out on the road. Now, a thing to keep in mind is when drivers get stopped by law enforcement, they get nervous. And what happens when people get nervous? They start to forget things. It makes it a little bit harder for them to recall things, and they revert back to what they know, which can include their prior language, their number one language that they use. Um, so I would do that. Start doing everything in English. When we identify somebody that may need some assistance, get them the assistance that they need. There are some associations that are doing English as a second language training for motor carriers. Look into that. Be proactive versus reactive, because once a driver gets placed out of service, that vehicle isn't moving while that officer is there. And if an officer does let that driver go, say, sit in the scale and they don't tow it, or they take them to a truck stop down the road and they set them there and they come back later, a few minutes later, and they're no longer there, that's going to happen once or twice, and then they're going to start towing vehicles.
Jackson, is there kind of a rule of thumb uh, in terms of how much out of service violations impact insurance cost, either as you think about it on a per vehicle cost annually or however you look at it? Any guidance you can give?
Yeah, so for CSA scores in general, we have a rule of thumb, and the data supports that per year you pay on average 500 to $1,000 more a truck for every alert you have. And so this is a 5-point violation for driver fitness. If you have start to stack these up, you're going to enter alert status for that. Driver fitness is one of the 7 basics. So all of a sudden you have an alert for driver fitness and your insurance prices could go up. And then specifically to the out of service piece, every one of my customers on this call knows about CAB, which is a paid insurance program that insurance companies use to analyze your scores as a motor carrier. That you look at in the portal, insurance companies look at through CAB. Well, CAB shows the national average for the driver out of service percentage, and then it shows your driver out of service percentage as a motor carrier, and it compares the two. And a lot of underwriters incorporate your out of service percentage relative to the national average in their underwriting rating models. And that can cost, if you're above the national average, that can cost another couple $100 more per truck per year in insurance cost.
That's a really good guidance there. Everyone's focused on June 25th. Mark, last comment here. Really, the more significant date may be in mid-July when CVSA kicks off Operation Safe Driver Week, July 13th through 19th, because it could be on day one, everybody goes slow, but 3.5 weeks later, it may be things may be happening much faster in terms of out of service. Any quick comments there?
Yeah, so CVSA Safe Driver Week is going to focus on reckless driving, I believe, this year. It may become a de facto secondary area of focus would be ELP, right? Officers are going to wait until their agency says, what they say on how to enforce ELP. They're not supposed to be putting people out of service until the earliest June 25th, but I think that officers may want to have this as an area of focus during that week. Officers just want to enforce the law. That's what they're doing. They want to make the roads safer. They don't want to just focus on certain populations of the US. So if they do find something, they're going to list it on the inspection report. And that's what they're going to do. And maybe they just wait, get a little bit of training on what the guidance is, because states will probably do some guidance off of what, or some training off of what the FMCSA's new guidance is, and then move forward from there.
Okay,
Just to add something to that,
yep.
I know sometimes states have their own details. So if it's not included for some reason, safe driver doesn't mean that they're not going to be out there having their own detail to see how much violations they might get as well.
Okay, so let's dig into the questions here. And in a couple cases, we may end up repeating ourselves. People come at, not everyone was on at 3:01. Yes, we are doing a recording of the seminar, and in the next few days, we will be sending that out. We'll also be sending out this slide deck as well. Um, so, look for that in the next few days. Let's see here. I'm just kind of scrolling down here. What is the common penalty for a CDL driver who has poor English language skills? Let's see here. I assume, I'm not sure if you mean,
They're probably talking about citations that are issued roadside.
okay.
They're different all over the United States. That is all defined by their state laws, or the county that they're operating in. In Wisconsin, that fine could be $265, but with Arkansas and their English language proficiency statute that they just put into place, I think it's $500 for the first violation and 1,000 for the second.
Starts adding up real quickly. And that's not the second for the same driver. That's the second within your fleet, right?
Uh,
I think it's per driver.
I think it's per
Okay.
driver as well.
Okay. Here's a question. Um, is the ELP from June 15th, 2016, will it be of any help? I'm talking about MO, MC, ECE. You may both of this know this one like the back of your hand, that prohibits officers putting drivers out of service who at least try to use a translating app, language card, or bringing an an English translator over the phone. So I'm not sure if the individual's question is this one still in effect or is it going away?
It
Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
it's gonna go away within the 60 days. We're just waiting to see what the new guidance is. But within 60 days, that's gonna go away.
Yeah.
Well, and when we say 60 days, you mean June 25th, right?
60 days from the executive order that President Trump put out.
Okay, and that was April 28th. So,
Yeah, FMCSA is required to do that. As of now, the old guidance hasn't been rescinded. They just gotta, it's still there. Some states are taking the wait and see approach. I know the state of Wisconsin is stating we're not changing anything as of right now. And nobody should be placed out of service until it is placed in the out of service criteria. And right now, that's slated to start June 25th.
and for those who, Mark, I know you answered a few questions online, but not everyone was probably looking at all the questions. Will the out of service show on a driver's MVR as a suspension?
No, out of services never get placed on an MVR.
Only citations, correct?
Citations, and normally only citations that relate to driving, vehicle equipment, or whatever the state has the regulations for that state for their MVRs. But you don't see out of service. If the driver gets caught the second time for an out of service violation for the same thing, and they get a citation for operating while ordered out of service, that can show up on an MVR because that's a different type of violation.
And we had a listener suggest it might be visible on their PSP, and you said, Mark, it will definitively be on the PSP.
It will.
Okay.
And for the B1 operations, I would recommend running those PSPs because if not, then you're not gonna find out if they've had those violations before.
So, yeah, be sure to run them. Don't take it for granted. Who determines if they understand the language well enough to pass? Is this up to the determination of the officer? The answer is yes. And we've tried to give some guidance around that. We joked about it a little bit. That officer really shouldn't be asking, your favorite sports team or your favorite rock band or whatever. But, there are a series of things. And Mark, I don't know if you have it handy, but we might want to bring up some of those questions from 2007, 2008. Daniel gave some good guidance that if you've got a lot of drivers between now and June 25th and they're good drivers, you want to keep not only bringing in English, but particularly helping them to understand how to answer level one questions, because that's where a level one inspection, those are kind of going to be the point of emphasis. Those types of things, where you've been, ELD questions, all of those things. Focus your training around that, at least in the short term. But there is, yes, tremendous. And the fear for everyone, of course, is what happens when you get an officer that is naturally biased in a negative way. I think all we can do is just shake our head. There's probably a few of them out there, just like in any population in the walk in life. There's mostly good apples, but there's the occasional bad one or someone who has an agenda. Let's see here. Mark, can you explain what set of questions or template will be used by the DOT officer to determine that driver does not have ELP proficiency? We can give some guidance, but I think
Yeah.
starting off, there is no set template, right?
There is no set template. It's all speculation that we'd be talking about from here. FMCSA did give out guidance in 2007 and 2008, questions to be asked during a roadside inspection to determine ELP. Some of those questions are, where did you start your trip today? Where are you driving today? How long have you been driving today? What are you hauling? Who are you driving for? What is the telephone number for the trucking company? They're all trucking related questions where where the individual roadside officer, if they're doing level two and level one inspections, the questions that they're going to be asked, it's not going to be questions, it's going to be statements. Driver, step on your brake, left directional, right directional, turn on your four ways, sound your horn, use your windshield wipers and fluids. I need to see your fire extinguisher, your warning triangles. And if the officer cannot get compliance because the driver did not understand what you're saying, then they can't do a level one. Who would go underneath the
Yeah.
vehicle saying hit your brakes to measure the braking systems and to check the frame systems? That makes it unsafe for the officer at that time. These are just some of the basic questions that are going to be asked during a roadside. Is FMCSA going to put that back into their guidance? We don't know. I'm hoping they have some guidelines in there for the officers to follow. Otherwise, it's going to be absolutely up to the officer's discretion on whether or not a driver can um, speak the English language and speak and read the English language well enough to respond to official inquiries. And that's what happens when the out of service comes in if they cannot do that.
Someone asked about recording during an inspection. You addressed that earlier, but again, for those that joined a little bit later, your recommendation is at a minimum to do an audio recording. And if you can do video on top of that, it's even better. As we know it, there's not a law that prohibits that, correct?
That's correct. If there's no state law that says you can't record in this area, then absolutely record. It can only help you at that point. Because if they're going to give you that violation, the only way that we will most likely get out of it through a data queue is if we have an audio recording. Because you're going to be going against the officer's word when there's no other witness to it other than the driver and the officer, and the state will always side with the officer unless we have some type of third party documentation, witness, video, or audio.
And about probably 80% of the inspectors nowadays have a video camera. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot.
that's also public information.
I think this is a clarifying question for Jackson. He said clarifying, I think you said PD also can't cover for the poor English speakers based on DOT out of service report.
Correct. So it's not as explicit as that, Michael, in the policy wording where it says we won't pay for towing if a driver's put out of service for not being able to speak the English language proficiently. It's that towing by itself is a supplementary coverage or a coverage extension. And there's wording in the policies that these supplementary coverages and coverage extensions only kick in after a covered accident. And then it explains and describes what a covered accident is. And being put out of service is not a covered accident. It has to be an actual motor vehicle claim, motor vehicle collision, or a fire, a theft, flood, something like that. So the coverage extension for towing will not apply in this, and we won't be able to claim reimbursement for it.
So a question after the out of service violation for not being English proficient, how much time does a driver do you have to send a new driver in to pick up the load? We talked about that a little bit. Hazmat, probably no time at all. They're going to get that off the road. They're going to get that probably, it's probably going to be towed and you'll start to ring up storage fees. But how about a more generic load like Bush's baked beans? Do
It
we
just
know if there'd be a little more latitude from the law enforcement official?
I think it just depends. It's going to be state by state or officer by officer. Because sometimes when you place you out of service, when you do a roadside inspection, say like you're on Interstate 10 in the middle of nowhere, they're going to probably escort you to the nearest place and then you go from there. So I think that's going to be officer discretion of when he thinks a tow should be called or not.
Yeah. Um, I think you probably better operate though, as if you're not going to have a lot of time until we start to see different states kind of set their own precedent. What I think we talked on this again, but it's probably worth repeating because everybody's trying to digest a lot here. What would be the outcome if a driver receives more than one out of service for ELP? Would this have serious implications? Yes, it would. I think
Yeah.
starts to
Yeah.
get to the insurance costs that Jackson alluded to, but back to Daniel and Mark, what's going to happen? You know, Bill over here is determined that he's not proficient in English. He's put out of service, and then 7 or 8 days later, same thing. What's going to happen between Mark and Daniel here?
I see citations being issued for operating while ordered out of service. Some states that may be a crime. State of Wisconsin had it as a crime, as a misdemeanor, and you lost your CDL. They changed that a few years back, but they upped the fine amount to like $2,500 for the first violation for operating while ordered out of service, and you still lose your CDL.
If we were to write one 391.11 violation under the federal codes, issue citation in Arizona, it would be a misdemeanor as well. If you don't take care of that, at the end of the day, they're going to issue a warrant if nobody shows up to court. So just know that if you continue driving, someday they're going to inspect and you're going to have a warrant for your arrest.
We may go a few minutes past the top of the hour just because there's so many great questions here. And I do want to let everyone know that on July 10th in Nashville at the Grand Hyatt Hotel, Reliance is having its fourth annual Trucking Matters Conference. It's 6 panels and presentations. We'll have a shipper panel, small and mid-sized motor carrier panel. We're actually having a litigation panel this year where a plaintiff's attorney is going to step into the lion's den with a defense attorney. Going to be an interesting deal. We've got really just a great lineup. Reshoring, we've got an expert there, a lady who helped companies offshore for over 20 years and has spent the last 12 years helping them come back home. She's going to talk about what's fact and fiction. We'll have a link to that when we send out a summary here, but July 10th. And by the way, Mark and Daniel are going to be there with their own exhibit, willing to talk to you about all things safety, including ELP here. So let's just kind of keep rattling through. Drivers cannot use the translator to help them understand better as it was allowed before, question mark. That is correct, at least from June 25th on. Although, as I think the guys have said, some states are already beginning to enforce now as if the ELP is already the new law. Other states are waiting until there's either FMCSA guidance or they're waiting for the actual deadline. So it kind of depends on your state, but the whole thrust of the executive order is that you have to speak some level of English credibly so that the officer believes that you can be understood, essentially. Um, Great question. Will the recovery driver also be required to pass ELP by the same officer who placed the other driver out of service?
Yes.
If the
Um,
officer is still there, very well, maybe they make him out and talk to him, right?
we see it right now where they write that violation for a driver and a co-driver as well because they speak to both of them. So
Yes.
So when I would do inspections and I would get a driver placed out of service for having a false logbook. It used to be that any falsification in logbook, you're automatically out of service for 10 hours. They'd
And I
bring
think
another driver in. I'd look at their logs before they started driving and
there you
make
go.
sure that they were good to go. And if they weren't good to go, I wouldn't let them drive.
I think as you both shared, though, it was fairly rare in your career when you did the same inspection on the same driver because you've moved on to other things, especially if it goes beyond today or the day that you're dealing with that driver. At what point does the employer, i.e., the trucking company that hired the driver, become accountable? Well, I think that's where plaintiffs' attorneys come in, and assuming this remains the law of the land in the coming years, then we will see new case law established. Do you guys have a comment beyond that?
I don't.
no.
Okay, let's keep going down here. That's the beauty of a webinar. There's always people thinking about things that we haven't thought about ourselves here. Is there a set of questions to test our drivers to ensure? I would refer people back to the questions the FMCSA laid out in 2007 and 2008. And of course, the guys have tried to give you some examples around a level one inspection. But if somebody wanted to go find those questions, Mark or Daniel, is that something that I guess we can just put the link to that when we send out the follow-up material?
Yeah, if we any material we can do, we can either attach it to it as because they're very, very difficult to find.
Oh,
Um,
yeah,
Yes, they are.
I couldn't find it when I was looking for it. I had a friend send it to me, John Seidel.
yeah.
So
Uh, Someone asked, is there a set of questions to test our drivers? We've kind of talked about that, but here's the essence of this individual's question. One officer may understand, but another one may not understand the driver. That's the whole frustration and why we're hoping that the FMCSA issues guidance on a bunch of points to try to remove some of the confusion. But at the end of the day, some of it's still going to be a little hazy after June 25th. How will the out of service affect the rating for the carriers? Well, Jackson talked about the CSA scores. Um, the OOS designation adds an additional 2 points to the CSA score, but it was 5 points to the what was it, driver
Driver's
fitness?
driver
fitness.
Driver
fitness.
fitness.
So seven
Um,
total points if out of service.
yeah,
Now, when they move to the new program, if they ever do, it's 1 point for the violation and it's 2 points if it's out of service.
and of course we've been waiting on that new point system
Yeah.
for a
Years.
little while, for a minute at least. Okay, good question here. Any suggestions for freight brokers regarding the ELP mandate? I don't know if we have any, but um, maybe as part of the overall compliance and vetting, you
Check.
probably raise that profile in how you're vetting motor carriers, but anything beyond that, guys?
If they have access to any type of program such as Central Analysis Bureau, that they can see what types of violations were listed. I mean, realistically, any freight brokerage can get the company's USDOT, the motor carrier's USDOT number, go to their SMS profile and see if they have any violations for ELP. Now going forward from today, there's not going to be many there because in the last 5 years, the number of violations for ELP ranged between 5 and 8,000 violations per year nationwide. In 2015, or is it 2014, when the out of service was still in effect, the 2016 guidance wasn't there. There was, I believe, 100,000 plus violations for ELP.
But I think even there, the number that got in trouble was a fraction of that, right? Yeah.
That got placed out of service. We got to understand that in that year, 2015, is when they took it out of the out of service criteria. So the fraction may have been during the time when it was in and part of the time when it was out. And since we
Yeah.
don't have that guidance yet from FMCSA, it's going to be very difficult for us to have any kind of determination on that. It's going to take some time. It's going to take a little bit of enforcement trends for us to see the trends, and we can give better guidance on that.
How will the process of the driver returning to the road look like? I think we've kind of talked about that. There was a big gray area. I mean,
Yeah.
even if Bob or Mary undertakes a crash course in English, we don't know how proficient they are. We don't know when they get pulled over again. Who's to say when they, a lot of that's going to have to be handled internally. And, that's where the management and leadership of each organization is going to have to be honest with themselves that this person over here is working really hard to learn English, but, they're going to need a little more time. And this other one picked it up very quickly. And focus on what Mark and Daniel talked about, things related to operating the truck, things related to a potential level one inspection, even though level one is a series of statements and commands, turn on your left blinker, etc. If they can't understand it, they're going to do the wrong function while they're sitting there in the truck. So that'll be self-evident. Um, I'm going to
Tom,
repeat.
real
Go ahead,
quick,
Mark.
a question that just came in that I have not even thought of that I think is a good one for Jackson. Can insurance company deny the liability referring to ELP violation that the driver might get after the incident, reasoning that the driver was not able to read the road signs?
Yeah, so right now, let me back up. If you're with an admitted insurance carrier, there is no ex policy exclusion on those forms that could prohibit coverage, specifically for auto liability, but for physical damage and cargo too, right? Now, if you were with a non-admitted insurance company, those insurance companies are not subject to the same rules and regulations and policy forms that admitted carriers must use, and they have the right to throw in any sort of exclusion that they want in there. Currently, that is not common practice to throw an exclusion in there related to the ability to understand and comprehend the English language. Could it be in 6 months or 12 months from now as this starts to get to enforced more? Maybe. And we as an agency need to come up with a game plan and make sure we're staying up on our policy forms and what carriers are throwing in there. But right now, no. If you have a claim, the driver was on the policy, it's going to get paid, even if there was then a violation assigned after the fact for an ELP violation. Just as if then after a crash, the driver gets a speeding violation, right, or a cell phone violation, the claim's still going to get paid.
Mark, I don't know if you can see the question from Monica at 402. If a CDL driver receives a violation related to ELP, will a citation be issued? Is it possible to fight that? You talked about that some, but maybe repeat again the process.
So any citation that's issued, you can go to court for. Matter of fact, I recommend that you go to court for it if it affects your CSA score. It's beneficial to the motor carrier, right? If we get a change of violation, the violation stands on the inspection report, but the point value goes down to 1. If it gets dismissed without court costs, or there is a not guilty verdict, then it gets removed from the inspection report and it will never show up on their MVR, which it won't show up on their MVR anyways. In non-English language proficiency, unless it's a state violation, which Arkansas has that state violation. Most other states don't have it. And then possibly in Arkansas, it could show up on an MVR, but I don't see it happening in other states.
For those that are on the call, Audra did include the link to Trucking Matters, but again, in our follow-up email, we'll also have that. We did talk about the non-domiciled CDL, in other words, B1 drivers, USMCA, let's kind of recap that again. Thoughts how that may impact. It's probably less about English. That was my opinion. You guys didn't say that. That's probably more about broader safety enforcement, frustrations that a lot of motor carriers have had that they've been coming into the country and running 20 to 30 days. Some drivers, not all drivers, of course, and thereby violate cabotage. But Mark or Daniel, and Daniel, you're down there all the time. So thoughts on that?
On non-domiciled,
Non-domiciled CDL?
I mean, there's a lot of them. I mean, Laredo is probably the biggest port of entry that brings product into the U.S. at the end of the day. But I think all this played a role as well. I mean, you got officer safety one, cabotage. So I think everything played a role into what's kind of happening today.
Yeah. There were a handful of motivating factors behind the president's executive order. I think it's fair to say. Um, Someone else, we've already kind of addressed interpreters. The way we understand it today, June 25th on, they're not going to be allowed. What about a phone app that allows a driver to maybe understand English a little bit differently? Any thoughts there again, or maybe the FMCSA needs to give guidance?
Yeah.
Uh, Go ahead, Daniel. I'll
We'll,
let you
we'll,
handle
we'll
that one.
wait and see what the guidance is, but as of now, that 2016 memo, as of June, as 60 days from that executive order, you're not going to be able to use a translator or a phone device. So we'll have to wait and see what FMCSA puts out.
Can that driver, did we touch on the team answers? I think somebody.
Yeah, we talked about it.
Yes.
Okay. Um, shouldn't the DMV be responsible for checking the drivers for English proficiency? Well, they may, or I mean, you guys weigh in on that.
That is out of FMCSA's and my purview. So I can't even begin to answer that one. That would just be an opinion on my part.
Someone asked when the guidance comes out, will we be able to see that guidance so that we can see if the officer truly followed it when conducting the ELP test? Um, I'm not sure if the guidance will be crystal clear. It will hopefully be less muddy than where we stand today, but any thoughts there, guys?
Um, we've all dealt with government. Does government make sense all the time? So not all the time. I'm hoping we have some good clear-cut guidance there. Um, and then once we have it, we'll share it with our clients, right?
Yep.
Other than that, we just gotta wait till it comes out and see what it says.
Here's another question. There's so many. What about a driver who is deaf using ASL or text to voice software? You guys have any thoughts on that? I don't think that's the spirit of this executive order, but you guys are former inspectors.
I think there's going to be some guidance on that when that memo comes out.
Okay.
So when we talk about deaf, I believe that's one of the disqualifying things. I'm not real up on that. I'd have to read the regulation, but you would have to have a waiver if you were deaf to have a CDL.
Here's
So, but I'm not up on that regulation. Actually, I'm gonna look it up right now though.
okay. This individual asked basically where this mandate's coming from. We've kind of talked about maybe the political motivation, but I think what's interesting is that in this case, he's talking about I encountered a driver whose CDL license got suspended in Pennsylvania 3 months ago due to the fact that he was not able to communicate with the officer. Was that just an officer that had a low tolerance that day or what?
And that's what I think we discussed on the citations. If they're in some states, they're misdemeanors as well. So I mean, court fines and stuff like that. If they're not paying them, then they'll probably suspend your license or revoke it.
Okay. Is OOS for ELP going to come with a citation or just OOS violation?
Depends on the officer.
And the state or just the officer?
It depends because I mean anybody could write a citation for it. It's going to come down to the officer if he wants to write a citation or not.
So on the team driving, if one driver's placed out of service, can the co-driver drive? Yes, but chances are he or she had already used up their hours of service, so that's why the other driver was driving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
once he has a sufficient amount of hours, and then he'll be able to drive as long as he's able to communicate, if the officer's still there.
Here's an interesting piece of feedback, Mark. I know you had talked about you believe Tennessee is beginning to enforce this, and
We know they are.
yeah, and
We've seen
here's
the inspections. We got denied on data queues on several of them.
well, and I was just going to relay that someone said that they had talked to an officer out of Tennessee. That individual officer said he's waiting on additional feedback. So a state may have a leaning one way or another until June 25th, but that doesn't mean 100% of the law enforcement officers are going to go that way.
That is true. Going back to the deaf,
Yep.
there, yeah, if you're deaf, you got to get a waiver. 391.41 parent B, parent 11 specifically talks about hearing.
Okay. Well, it's about 4:15. Let's see. As we look at the very latest questions, kind of collectively, we do want to end this. Boy, they keep coming in though, and we still have well over 200 people. Guys, you want to take everybody kind of take a quick look at these last three or four that came in. Folks are asking about Arkansas.
Do you have feedback on ELP violations from state? I know it's going to go into effect August 5th, but I think they're going to go off of the memo as well. First violation, like Mark said, 500. Second violation is going to be 1,000, but it does go into effect August 5th.
Yeah, everybody's citations isn't mandated by FMCSA. That's all state and local laws that they run off of that. That's usually always published within their jurisdiction of what those violations cost. So it's going to vary by the state.
Jackson, can you handle a couple of questions at 4:17 from Bridget and KD while I look at something else?
Yeah.
Just as a reminder, well, we still have a really good crowd on here. We've tried to encourage people to put their questions in the chat icon rather than the Q&A, but I'm going to look up those that are in the Q&A right now while Jackson handles Bridget and KD's questions.
So what if a driver has an active out of service but is approved to be added onto a policy because it does not show on the MVR? Will this affect coverage? Again, depends on the carrier, but if he was added to the policy and he was okay to be added at the time, most carriers will apply coverage then. But again, you need to read the policy in the form because especially non-admitted, there could be a clause in there that the driver must meet the driver guidelines at the time of accident. And if the MVR didn't show it when he was added, but the license is suspended at the time of the accident, then there could be evidence for the insurance company to deny the claim. So we might be dealing with those in the near future. But again, depends on the policy and the carrier you're with.
Um, Kind of interesting question with a little bit of humor there. Drivers with heavy accents, not just immigrants, but U.S. citizens like from the South, you all. Extremely difficult to understand. Parts of the Northeast, that Boston accent, etc. Any thoughts there, whether they could potentially get listed as not being very, I'll call it ELP compliant?
I'd say no on that. I mean,
Yeah.
I used to deal with the Northeast people. They talk a little strange to me, being in the Midwest. But normally you can get through it. For
Yeah.
me to list an EOP violation, we couldn't do an inspection. We
Wow.
literally couldn't get it done because they couldn't understand it, right? They literally couldn't answer any questions about their logbook at the time, right? They couldn't answer any questions about the load, Um, that's at the point where I would issue a violation for it when I was working.
Yeah. Or
And
if
that
they
was
can't give you
prior,
the license.
right. And that's prior to the 2016 guidance. When they came out with the 2016 guidance, you were required. Well, in my state, I required them to get an interpreter. I'd say call your company. As long as they can get a hold of somebody that can do that, then we were good to go. Because it really limited on when a violation could have been written at that point. So
On a more serious nature, someone asked about a dyslexic individual. That might be, we're kind of poking fun at the Northeast and the Southeast dialects, but Any thoughts on someone who may be dyslexic?
See, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty, and that may be an issue, but I don't think that is listed as a disqualifying offense from getting for physical qualifications.
Okay.
But dyslexic people, literally, I have never known a person to be dyslexic just by talking to them, right?
Right.
So as long as they can understand what I'm saying, I can understand what they're saying, and even if it takes a couple of times for me to say step on the brake, turn in your left directional, where are you coming from today? We're gonna be okay. Having difficulty is one thing, but not being able to talk at all or understand you at all, that's quite a bit of different thing. And that's where the officer discretion is going to come in. Is it going to be um, handled differently throughout the US? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, here's an interesting question that kind of ties in. Will there be a written test or only a verbal one during the roadside inspection? I think it's always verbal, but um,
I don't think there's gonna be a written. I mean,
yeah,
at least we haven't heard that there's gonna be a written, but we'll wait and see once the guidance comes out. But I don't think there's gonna be a test. It's just gonna be if you're able to communicate sufficiently with that officer.
yeah. And so another person asked, how can I know if my drivers have the English level that they need? What kind of questions or tests can I give to them to make sure they're prepared? He didn't word it quite that way, but I think, Mark, are you okay if we include those questions from several years ago? I mean, it doesn't mean that they're going to be asked today, but they're certainly questions that a law enforcement official could very well ask.
They very well could ask, and a lot of them, they pertain to it somewhat. Um, but the best way for you to do it before guidance is handed out is put them through a mock inspection.
Yeah,
And put them through a mock inspection with somebody that doesn't understand the language of the driver that you're doing the inspection on, because there will be some leniencies for a person or an officer to want to assist that driver out, or they may hear that driver say something in that other language that you pick up on right away, and I would have like, because I only speak one language, that'd be like, what is that? I have no idea what you just said, right? So I would use somebody that only speaks English and speaks no other language to do a mock inspection and just do a walk around, checking the lights, having the driver hit the brakes. And if the driver doesn't understand certain things, then we know that there may be an issue coming down the line when everything gets published, right? And so we get them the help that they need. We get them that English as a second language, and we have them keep up on it. Maybe it's investing in language software. I don't know. I don't know. I don't have that perfect thing. I'm here to give what law enforcement perspective is on this, since I did it for 22 and a half years, and
right.
all of it was roadside inspections. I never went and did anything else other than DOT inspections. So, and I did a lot of training, not specifically for ELP, but you get a real good idea of what officers are looking for. And when you do the amount of data queues that Daniel and I do, you hear that same language back from the states. They talk the same way that we do. And this is why we're so good at doing data queues, is we speak their language, we know what they're looking for, we understand their thought processes. And our job right now is to help our clients and prospective clients navigate this new territory that we're in, so we don't get into any trouble. We don't get our drivers placed out of service, and we don't have those issues and avenues to help mitigate that. So um, moving forward, we don't have it in the future. I mean, it's going to be a learning curve, without a doubt.
I'm going to combine a couple questions here, one from Johnny, one from Mariah. When will the guidelines come out? We don't know. I think Mark and Daniel are checking the FMCSA website pretty much daily. When the guidance comes out, will we be able to see it to verify that officer followed it when conducting the test? Yeah, you'll be able to get that. How specific it will be remains to be seen. Obviously, if there's a case to potentially data queue it, I would suggest if you're not sure, that's when you want to reach out to Mark and Daniel. Their batting average, they win over 70% of their data queue challenges. Here's a good question though. What about a driver who's getting their CDL after June 15th, so just a week or 10 days, I guess, before? Would they go through any testing at the driving school that will prove his or her ELP capability?
You would think so if it's a good driving school.
Yeah.
I, but I have no knowledge on that.
Yeah, I think that's where you all have to put pressure on your driving schools that you're working with. Hey, this needs to be a point of emphasis. And as we shared earlier, work with your state and local trucking associations. The LMCA, the Laredo Motor Carrier, has been out on this probably as in front of this issue as much as anyone here. Um, will ESP test, I think they means ELP test, be required at the DMV when renewing the CDL? Um, and can a renewal be denied due to lack of English proficiency? Do we know if the ELP test is going to be again, DMV, that's state, not,
Yeah, it's they should be doing them in English.
yeah,
So
Right. And FMCSA may come out with more guidance on that.
yeah. Okay, that's a good question here. Obviously, folks are thinking about a lot of issues. We still have nearly 200 people on here, and we've gone well past our time. Guys, do you see any other hot button questions that we haven't kind of addressed in one form or another? Let's see here. Jackson, why don't you put your email in real quick if you haven't already?
I did. I typed there in
Okay.
there. In one question, I see a couple that are along the same theme. And Mark, Daniel, what would be sufficient evidence to provide when submitting a data queue for an out of service for ELP to revoke the decision? How do you prove that they could speak English? It's a tough one.
It's
That's like
it's
proving a negative.
Yeah.
it's going to be very, very difficult. Okay. Um, I do a data queue class. I'm going to be doing one here in Nashville, coming up in July about how to do data queues. Couple of things. One, if the officer doesn't put down any notes, you got to wait some time and then possibly attack the officer because they didn't put down qualifying information on why the violation was written. So we got to let the officer forget about it. Number two, if you have evidence, audio, video with audio, showing that the driver was complying and whatnot, and then we can use that as evidence as well. Um, it's going, if you have no third party, and a co-driver being a third party is the same as being the driver, in my opinion. The state is going to take the weight of that co-driver, maybe a little bit higher than they would the driver. Their thoughts on it, or their whatever that their statement is on why it should be overturned. But the weight of the officer is going to be way, way higher unless you have some independent third party stuff to show otherwise. And again, we're going to have to wait for the guidance. And when the guidance comes out and there is certain steps that need to be hit for this violation to be written, then if the officer doesn't put that in their inspection report, then we attack that as well, that the officer didn't hit all these different things that were in the guidance, but we don't know what that guidance is. So it is going to be very, very difficult to have these removed, in my opinion, without some type of audio recording.
I agree 100%. There's another question too. If a driver's found to be proficient in English, can you use that to fix past and future out of service inspections if the driver's found not proficient in those instances? Well, I think you're the professional, but my sense is if you go back in time, how do we know that between that violation a month ago or last year and now they haven't been taking a crash course in English? I think that's going to be tricky without audio or video to show that they were proficient in both occasions. In the future, I think that's we again, it would be helpful to have audio or video or both. I think it's going to be a little bit dicey. It could be that, to Daniel's point earlier, that maybe a driver after June 25th who speaks nominal English, but the inspector is from South Texas and is bilingual, and the driver, speaks Spanish and feels like he really understands all the issues there and not quite as well in English. There may be a little bit of gray room there where he got past. Again, this is the big subjective uh, situation that we've been discussing for the last 90 minutes. There's some things where we can get black and white around insurance, but some of these other instances, it's not as black and white. All right. Um, okay, Mark will be doing that data queue class on July 8th. You can check out details from the Tennessee Trucking Association webinar. We may do, as part of our Trucking and Safety Matters series down the road, we may have one dedicated to doing some of the more common data queues that would help you out. We don't have that scheduled. Until then, check out TTA. I think we are kind of out of the questions now. Woo, guys, that was a good one. I want to thank our audience. We still have 177 people here. Quick synopsis. It is being recorded. We will make the slides available. Um, the Trucking Matters link will be in that. I don't know if that'll be going out tomorrow or early next week in terms of a compilation from today, but we will be following up with all of you who registered. We want to thank you on behalf of Reliance Partners, and we'll take 10 seconds here to show Mark and Daniel's contact information once again. Take a screenshot of it if you need to get a hold of them before the replay materials go out. Guys, any last closing thoughts?
For clients,
Or just anything?
yeah, for clients, give us a call when you have questions regarding the DOT regulations. For prospective clients, we handle insurance very well, and then you get access to two former DOT roadside officers that are excellent at what they do.
Well, just thank you for joining. If you guys need help, send us an email or give us a call.
Yes, please do. I'm going to take a screenshot of this, and we may follow up in our material and answer one or two more questions. Bear with me, everyone. Okay, thank you. And how do I sign out of here? All right. Thanks again, everyone.
Take care.